Thomas and Friends, James and the Diesel Engines. Crosslines. Most of the Fat Controller's engines, except Diesel's, James had never liked them. They're all right, said Henry. Just mixed traffic engines like you and me. Mixed up engines, you mean, James grunted, with windows at each, and how can they know if they're coming or going? Toby had two cabs, remarked Duck, and he gets on all night. Toby's just a little engine, scoffed James. If an important engine like me didn't know which way to turn, what would the railway come to? All the engines agreed that James was becoming much too puffed up in his smoke box, making out his royalty or something, grumbled Henry. It's disgusting. I know an engine called King James, remarked Doc. In the old days at Paddington, King James, he was, but he didn't swank about like that. Ouch. Didn't I be telling James that? Pled Donald. It's even more of a mystery. He'll be making or lives. Exactly, agreed Henry. But who's going to turn his wheels for him? The engines tried all sorts of ideas, but nothing worked. James grew so confident that the others were glad when he was away. Even the coaches twittered anxiously to each other, for if they thought he was to pull them. One day James came to the shed fuming with rage. Shunting, he snorted. Where are Donald and Douglas? They should be here for jobs like that. But the twins were helping on Edward's branch line, so James had to do the work himself. James's train had long trucks called well wagons. These have boggy wheels at each end, with a low section between them. They are used to carry cars, tractors, and other heavy machinery. The shunting should have been easy, but James was cross and bumped the trucks. Oh, they cried. Some of them slipped their brakes on to spite James. The weather was dumb and misty too, so the shunting took a long time. At last, James had only 2 trucks to fetch before his train was ready. Because of the mist, the signalman sometimes found it hard to see what was happening. James's driver told him that James would whistle when they had collected all the trucks and were clear of the points. They had almost finished when suddenly James heard a sharp peep peep from another engine close by. The signalman heard it too and thought it was James, saying he was ready. He pulled the lever, setting the points for the main line. But James wasn't ready. The points changed. When one of the trucks was halfway over them, one bogie went the right way, but the other was diverted towards the main line. Before James realized it, the truck was traveling sideways between the 2 lines. A signal stood right in its path. Stop, squealed the trucks, but it was too late. The signalman toppled to the ground with a crash, just missing James. That's torn it, said James's driver. The Fat Controller won't like that. He didn't. He spoke severely about it because the signal was important and its loss was inconvenient. James knew that the accident was not his fault, but he was usually quiet in the shed. That evening, the others were relieved. I suppose it must be difficult to know which way to go when you've got two cabs, whispered a voice. But to go two ways at once with only one cab, that really is something. James pretended he hadn't heard. Deep freeze. Winter had come, and for many days now had held everything in an icy crib. The countryside was frozen hard. Trees were white with frost and icicles hung from bridges and water columns. Mercifully, there was little snow. Too cold for that, thank goodness, shivered James's driver as he and the fireman huddled on the shelter side of the cab. James had an open footplate, and every day his crew came to work, muffled to the eyebrows in scarves and jerseys. Sometimes water columns froze too, and then the engines could not get the water they needed. But this never happened at the workstation. And one day, when the frost seemed harder than ever, James's driver stopped him beside the water column there. "We'll give you a good topping up while we can," he said. "There's no telling when we might get some more." James shivered as the icy water clutched into his tender, but he knew his driver was right. They filled James's tank to the brim because the fireman forgot to tell the driver to turn the tap off. Water overflowed onto James's tender, making him shiver again. "Right," said the fireman, jumping down to the footplate. "Let's be off. I want to warm myself up," shivered Cold. "We can't go yet," laughed the driver. "They haven't finished loading the luggage van." "Well, I finished." They hurried, grumbled the fireman, blowing on his hands. "I'm frozen from standing on that tender." All the engines have a tab called an injector. It allows the driver or fireman to transfer water from the tender to the boiler, and it is very important. Without it, the water level in the boiler could become too low to make steam properly. They had not gone far before James felt thirsty. "I need a drink, please," he said. His driver switched on the injector, but nothing happened. The fireman tried his to apply it, still nothing. "I've got such a pain," groaned James. "Your injectors failed," said his driver. "Blockage in the pipe, most likely. We'll have to stop and deal with your fire. Can't go on without water." "Don't set the sleepers on fire," pleaded James. "Henry would never let me forget it." The fireman laughed. "You'll be all right if we just damp you down," he said. "There's no need to throw the fire out as Henry did." They stopped near a signal box, and James's driver asked the signalman to telephone for help. The works sent a diesel whom James had never met to help him. "Rescued by a diesel?" he snorted disgustedly. "It's disgracing. I won't go." But he soon changed his mind, because now that his fire was down, his boiler was cooling, and he could feel the icy wind. The diesel was friendly. James was quiet at first, but by the time they reached the works, the diesel had won him over, and the two of them were chattering like old friends. At the works, James's fireman climbed on to the tender. He tried to open to fill a cab, but couldn't. There's your answer, James, he said. Your filler cap's frozen solid. That's because the water overflowed. Ice is stopping air from getting into the tank, so the injectors can't work. You'll be all right when the ice melts. And that wasn't all. Thanks to his new friend from the works, even James now admit that diesels can be useful engines too. The end.